all the different aspects of human personality are compared to different parts of the chariot. The charioteer, the one who drives the chariot, and then the reins that are used for controlling the horses themselves, and also the road through which we travel. Here, our individual soul, who continues to be born again and again, depending upon his or her activities, is the passenger. He is traveling. And his intellect is the driver. He is the one who drives the chariot. And we need horses. Horses are senses of action and senses of perception. We can very easily understand. Our whole human life consists of different actions. Actions at the mental level, intellectual level, physical level, thought level. A word is an action, a thought is an action, even a fleeting thought is an action at the intellectual level. So, all the senses of perception, the sense of speech, hearing, taste, touch, smelling, and so on, and also all the senses of action, the feet that we use for walking, the hands that we use for doing work, and so on. All these senses are like the horses. Now, how do we control the horses? Because it is very important to control the horses properly. If the horses are not properly controlled, they may take you in the wrong direction, and instead of reaching a destination, we may end up in a precipice. We may be taken to some by-lanes and highways, unnecessary paths. Sometimes it can lead to accident also. So we need something with which we control the horses, the senses. Mind is the instrument by which we control the horses. So reins is the mind. Intellect is the driver of the chariot. Our human personality, individual human beings are the passengers. And then how do these the chariots move? Through certain well-defined paths. Now, the paths or different directions are like the sense objects, because the horses are the senses. The senses, sense of perception, sense of action, or they will have to move in one direction. And the path, the road, the highway by which we travel are the sense objects. So what we see is important. And our interaction with what we see or what we hear, what we pursue, very much depends upon how we control the horses. Horses are indriyas, senses. And if the senses are not properly controlled, our whole human life becomes a failure. Those who are intelligent enough, those who have got the wisdom to properly control the horses, so that the horses take the right path, leading to the right destination, we'll have to exercise the mind properly. Because mind is an instrument, that is the driving instrument by which we control the senses. So if the mind is not properly utilized to control the senses, and if the senses or the horses are not properly controlled, the horses will take us in the wrong direction. Therefore, an intelligent charioteer should make proper use of his or her mind, so that the horses are forced to move in the proper direction, so that we reach the ultimate destination. This is the human journey. Now, how do we react to different situations, both external and internal? Here, as I said, last time I said, what is human personality? What is the characteristic of the passenger who is traveling in this chariot? Whatever we do in this life, in whatever way we respond to the stimuli coming from outside, all depends upon our character. And character is the sum total of all the actions that we have done in the past. See, whatever we are right now is the sum total of the subtle residual elements of whatever we have done in the past. I can give just a practical demonstration. Whatever we do, either with our intelligence, mind, or our senses of perception like hearing, speech, etc., all these actions will leave a subtle residual element in our mind. And these impressions, tendencies together constitute what we normally call human character. It is this human character which decides how we respond to the external situations, etc. That's one thing. So our response, our reaction, our interaction with the external world is decided or determined by our character. But our character also is formed by our actions. So the actions together constitute character, and character determines our actions. Now, how do these activities, these actions form what we call the phenomenon that we call human character? The theory is this: whatever we do consciously, any action could mean a fleeting thought in the mind, a word that we speak, or an action that we deliberately do. All this will create an impression in our mind, which ultimately adds to the totality of what we call human character. Suppose you are walking in the street. We see many things. We will see different vehicles, passengers, pedestrians, and so on. We don't notice them. They do not leave a residual impression in our mind because we do not take notice of them. But suppose we see a strange animal or a totally strange, unexpected vision, sight, or something happens that is totally strange, new, and unexpected. Immediately, that event will leave the impression within us. So whatever we do deliberately will create an impression, will leave a tendency or impression in our mind. And these impressions together constitute the totality of human character. Shall we keep it there, Swamiji? Just one second.
Won't you try speaking? Just
It's clear?
Oh, it's not on.
It's not working. Can you hear? Okay. Yes. So, if we do any action,
with deliberation and concentration, immediately it registers in our mind. And then this impression will work in two different ways in future. If that action produces a pleasant result, we will have a tendency to repeat that action. If the action produces an unpleasant result, we will have a tendency to avoid it. So this is always happening. So our total human personality is the totality of all the actions that we have done, not only in this life, but even in the past life. That's why you find we sometimes feel that we cannot help behaving in a particular manner. As if, even if you deliberate, if you decide, you think, well, I will do this certain thing in a given way, in a given manner tomorrow. But when the moment comes, we may not be able to do that. We feel that there is something other than our own mind which is controlling us. You find that's why even the greatest of behavioral scientists become eccentrics. They teach us how to behave properly. You find how to interact, how to be sociable, how to talk in a logical manner, how to be friendly with all, even intelligibility, adjustability, sociability, the ability to coexist with all other people in a very coherent manner. These are the characteristics of a healthy-minded person. But a psychiatrist who teaches all these, who may have written dozens of books on this very subject, may behave in a bizarre, unexpected manner. It often happens. Why? Because his own mind is not within his control. Which means there is something other than the mind, other than those factors which are within our perfect control, which are at work. We can be sure how a machine works, because a machine has got a programmed intelligence, which is our creation. But we can never be sure how our own mind works. So in Vedanta it's called Anusruta Swabhava. The word is very interesting. Anusruta means something which comes in a mighty flow, maybe from past lives, not in the immediate past life. Maybe we may have accumulated certain impressions, tendencies, characteristics, maybe 1,000 years back. It will be there. That suddenly comes to the surface when we come in contact with an identical experience or object. Immediately that tendency comes to the surface. The people who have studied Vedanta, maybe in previous life, suddenly you find in this life, when accidentally they come across certain idea, suddenly the mind reacts to that. This has happened in the case of two great American literary and mystical figures. One is Thoreau, the other is Whitman. So they were both students of Upanishads and Gita, both of them. So this inherited, unknown and unknowable force propels our mind and our behavior in a particular manner. This phenomenon, this mechanism consists of 8 different units according to Vedanta. 8 units. The first unit is all the 5 senses of perception. Now you may ask the question, how can you argue that our actions in this life with our speech, one of the 5 senses of perception, is determined by our action in previous life, because this whatever senses of action we had in previous life perished when our body came to an end. They don't survive. When body comes to an end, the senses of perception and senses of action all come to an end. Then how do we remember the previous tendencies? So Vedanta says the subtle memories that we have accumulated through actions in previous life are accumulated in mind. Our hands are new now. These hands belong to this life. But whatever we had done with our hands in previous life has created an impression or tendency in our mind which remains in that in this life. So we will have a tendency to act in the same identical manner. Senses of action and senses of perception do not survive. They perish with the body. But their actions and their activities are remembered through their residual forms, the impressions and tendencies created by their actions. So we are forced to act in a particular manner. So the first unit is the senses of action. Second unit is senses of perception. The third unit is the 5 vital energies. Let us say what you call prana, 5 vital energies. The fourth unit is the 5 elements which in fact create this body. The fifth unit is a combination of 4 factors: mind, intellect, egocentric consciousness or egocentrism, and memory. Whatever we do consciously is kept in the memory in the form of a tendency. That is called chittam. And accordingly, we identify ourselves in this life. For example, if you are seeing an object from a distance and if there is not enough light, a pillar may look like the figure of a human being from a distance. So your mind is wavering whether it is a pillar or a human being or a figure of a human being. Your mind is working here, speculation. When you reach the object, you come to a decision, well, it is a pillar, not a human being. Your intellect is working because it decides what the object is. At the third stage, you suddenly remember, well, I have seen, in fact, this is a pillar which I have seen the previous day. So there you identify yourself with the person who has seen the same object the previous day. There your ego consciousness works. And then when you recollect, oh, this is the pillar which I saw last week also. Suddenly you remember the picture of the pillar, so the object is suddenly remembered in your mind. So these 4 faculties of mind together is the 5th unit. The 6th unit is our ignorance of our true nature. What it is, we think we are this body, we are this mind, we are the psychophysical mechanisms which are responsible. This wrong identification with our own body as the only reality, which is because of the ignorance of the fact that we are the supreme consciousness. Because we are not aware of the fact that we are the supreme consciousness, we think we are just this physical body or mind, psychophysical mechanism. Nothing more than that. This ignorance is the 6th factor. The 7th factor is our desire for various worldly objects, which is rooted on the wrong identification that we are this body. If we think that we are the eternal, the immanent, all-pervading, transcendental reality, the supreme consciousness, which is called Atman, then we won't have any desire for empirical things. But if we think we are this body, then we will have a desire for things which give pleasure to this body. If you think you are this mind, then you have a desire for things which gives pleasure to the mind, and so on. This is the 7th factor. And the 8th factor is actions which are driven by this desire. In fact, this is what we call human personality. What human personality is, in short, this one. Our senses of perception, senses of action, memories, then desire to do things, actions which produce different results. In short, all these memories stored in our mind together constitute what we call character or human personality. Now, so long as we are the human, we are convinced that we are nothing but this human body or psychophysical mechanism, we are bound to live in this world suffering and enjoying. When we get something empirical, something which gives us pleasure to our senses, we enjoy, we are happy. When we lose that, we become unhappy. So we are just tossed about in this mighty way of life between fleeting experiences of pain and pleasure. Now, there is the path for freedom. In another Upanishad, there is an interesting imagery of how a person attains freedom. This freedom, as I said earlier, doesn't come from outside. This freedom is within. There is a story of a small boy. It comes in the Chandogya Upanishad, the 4th chapter. In ancient times, the great sages used to live in forest hermitages, and youngsters, young boys, grown-up people, sometimes kings and emperors, giving up their palaces, used to go to these sages seeking spiritual wisdom. There is one interesting story in one of the Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, one of the metaphysical works. A boy wanted to study the highest spiritual metaphysics, and he went to his guru, his teacher. He was a small boy. The teacher found that he was an extremely fit, spiritually elevated person who is fit to be taught highest spiritual wisdom. How that the teacher taught him the supreme wisdom? He asked him, the story is a bit crude, but behind this story there is a great spiritual message behind. The story is from a book which must have been written around 3000, 4000 BC. So you have to remember the antiquity of the book. Pastoral society, where teachers lived in forest hermitages and children used to help their parents by looking after herds of cows, etc. So one boy went to his teacher. The boy's name is Satyakama. He told him, requested him, please teach me the highest spiritual wisdom. You know how the teacher taught him? He said, he gave him 400 cows, 400 weak, emancipated cows, and said, you take these cows to the forests. You return only when they reach the number of 1000. It's a very interesting story. In fact, there is a deeper message behind the story, a great metaphysical truth, Satyakama Jabala story. There is a background behind the story that is not relevant in this context, but I give the story portion. So the boy took these 400 emaciated cows. They were not old cows, but emaciated cows, to the forest. And then, as I said, told him, you don't return till the number has reached 1000. Now this boy was an extremely sincere, honest, spiritual seeker. So what he did, he continuously worked hard, served the cows, looked after them well. So within a few years, the number reached 1000. When the number reached 1000, when there were altogether 1000 cows, one bull came out and called out his boy, "Hey Satyakama, I am going to teach you 1/4 of the spiritual wisdom." This is the story goes. I am going to teach you just 1/4. And a big bull came to him. No, normally bulls don't come and teach you spiritual wisdom. What really happened, when this boy applied his whole mind, intellect, everything to the simple task of looking after these cows as a spiritual sadhana, as a spiritual practice. his mind became pure. So the voice did not really come from the bull, the voice came from within himself. So through sincere, disinterested, unselfish action, without any selfish motive, if we perform, our own mind becomes pure. And the wisdom actually comes from within. Spiritual wisdom does not come from outside. It comes from within. That's why earlier I said, spiritual enlightenment is self-discovery. In fact, we don't get any new knowledge. We really understand our true nature. So in a way, spirituality or spiritual knowledge is our true nature. Spiritual ignorance is something foreign to us. It is alien to us. Our true nature is the Supreme Consciousness. The Supreme Consciousness which is immanent, which is omnipresent, all-pervading and transcendental. Which is knowledge absolute, consciousness absolute and bliss absolute. This is our true nature. So, liberation or getting freedom doesn't mean we are gaining something new that we did not already possess. We are just removing the wrong notion that we are not free. The wrong notion that we are bound. So in a way, in other words, freedom is not something that we gain. Freedom is something that we rediscover within ourselves. So when this boy, with great sincerity, with great honesty and sincere faith, tried to obey the instructions of his teacher by looking after these emaciated cows, immediately what happens? From his own inner soul, the truth came out. So, but this metaphysical work uses a symbol. It says a bull came and taught him this 1/4 of supreme wisdom. So that's what really happens. So, when we do our duty and due responsibility without any selfish motive, when we de-link between what we do and our attachment, selfish attachment towards its result, then our true nature comes. Our mental impurities get completely purged off and our true nature is revealed. So this bull said, I am going to teach you 1/4 of supreme wisdom, spiritual wisdom. And that's how the Upanishad says. And after some time, the fire, Agni, which is fire, fire taught him the next 1/4 of supreme wisdom. What really happened? In the evening, he was performing his fire sacrifice. He suddenly felt the fire is speaking to him. The goddess fire. Actually, it is not so. He was performing all these duties and responsibilities, his meditation, everything, with absolute unselfishness. It's called yoga. This is yoga, in fact. This is the reality of yoga. So, when all his activities were rooted on total unselfishness, when he could completely de-link whatever he was doing with whatever results those actions may produce, then another part of his mind became pure. And that means a little more spiritual wisdom suddenly dawned on his mind. This idea is put in symbolic language. The fire taught him the next 1/4 of spiritual wisdom. He continued, and after some time a swan came and taught him 1/4, and the last portion was taught by another bird. This is how the Upanishad says. The idea is this. We are talking about yoga, jnana yoga, karma yoga and so on. Whatever may be the form of yoga we practice, whether the path of action with total unselfishness or the path of spiritual or metaphysical analysis, jnana yoga, or psychic control through physical and psychological restraint and control, whatever may be. All these yogas, all these paths help us to rediscover our true nature. Because our mind is sometimes compared to a lake. Whenever we try to practice yoga, meditation or spirituality, you will be surprised. Suddenly a lot of confusions, perplexities, lot of doubts will emerge in the mind. Sometimes you often find any spiritual, any sincere seeker, you ask anyone, lot of confusions will come. That's because our mind is often compared to a lake. And in this lake, say for example, about 70% of the lake is covered with dust, filth, maybe a lot of waste matter. And 30% may be pure water. Now, if you try to stir with a long stick, if you try to stir this lake, what happens? You are trying to clean up the lake, but the moment you stir the lake, the waste, the dust, and maybe the weeds which are growing below will come to the surface. On the other hand, if our lake is 95% dirt and filth, only 5% pure water, and if you simply keep quiet, there will be no disturbance in the lake. Because 95% of the lake is covered with weeds, filth, dirt and water. Only 5% on the top there is some clean, quiet water. If you don't try to clean up the lake, then there will be no disturbance. So every spiritual attempt, every attempt to practice spirituality is like taking a long stick and trying to stir the lake. We have to clean it. So every spiritual attempt can create problems, but the point is, all these ideas, whether reading, listening to all these ideas are helpful for us to clean up the lake of our mind. And for that, we need to practice spirituality. And now, what is the nature of this freedom? That also I want to speak a few words about nature of freedom. Another imagery is there, just like the chariot imagery, there is another imagery. If you think of a tree with two branches, on the top branch there is a bird sitting, and below there is another bird sitting. But there is a difference. Both birds look alike. They look alike, but there is one fundamental difference. The bird sitting on the top branch is doing nothing. It simply sits quiet. It is not worried about anything. It is not overjoyed. But the bird that is sitting on the lower branch is sometimes eating sweet fruits, sometimes bitter fruits. When it eats sweet fruits, it is very happy. But you can't always get sweet fruits. In human life also, we will have good experiences and also unpleasant experiences. So when the bird eats sweet fruits, it is very happy. But when he has to eat sour fruits, bitter fruits, it is unhappy. So the imagery goes like this. The bird that is sitting below slowly is hopping. It is jumping forward, moving forward towards the other bird sitting on the top, which is sitting quiet, still, without enjoyment or without suffering, without misery and enjoyment, because it is not eating anything, neither sweet fruits nor sour fruits. Now the bird sitting on the top is a symbol of freedom, and the bird sitting below is the symbol of spiritual slavery. So, this in the Mundagopanishad you find a verse, Dva Suparna Savija Sakhaya Samanam Vriksham Parishusya Jade Tayor Enne Pippalam Swadati Anasnan Anyo Apichakasidi. It's a very famous imagery. A tree with two birds, one on the top, the other below. The bird below is eating sweet fruits and also bitter fruits. It enjoys and it suffers. In human life also, we are often we are dangling between enjoyments and sufferings. Some experiences make us jubilant and some experiences make us miserable. So how to go beyond both? The only way to avoid misery is to avoid seeking misery. So long as we are going in search of happiness, we will have to suffer misery. So the only way to avoid misery is to avoid happiness. To stop seeking happiness. Because misery and happiness, unhappiness and happiness are two sides of the same coin. A real yogi should be able to look at both with an equanimity of mind. This is the only way to freedom. We can never be really free so long as we are looking for happiness alone, because such a situation, such a condition is absolutely impossible. Now, I shall just explain this idea on the basis of few more stories. How this really happens. One story is this, how our actions produce result. There is a story of a great king. His name is Jada. Bharata is a name. He became called Jada Bharata. He was a great king. And when he became old, because he had studied Vedanta Yoga, he thought enough. He renounced his kingdom and comforts, and he made his son the next ruler, and he left the kingdom and went to a forest and spent the rest of his lifetime in meditation and yogic practices and contemplation, spiritual practices. He wanted to be a mystic. Now, in course of time, it so happened that a female deer was chased by a lion, and as it tried to cross a stream, it gave birth to a baby and it died on the spot. This happened in the presence of this king. You have to think of this story. The story is very interesting, and it's an off-quoted story. It gives in a nutshell the real meaning of law of karma, rebirth, and also spiritual liberation, the practice of yoga. All these concepts are involved in this story. You have to think of the king who renounced his kingdom, went to the forest to practice meditation and yoga. And once a tragic incident took place in front of his eyes. A female deer, chased by a lion, tried to cross the stream in front of his hermitage, and as it tried to cross over, it died, it fell in the stream, but it gave birth to a small baby deer. Now this king became compassionate, and he saved this baby deer, and it started growing in the hermitage. And then the king became so much attached to this deer. The king who had renounced his kingdom, his palace, his comforts, everything, in search of spiritual wisdom, became so attached to this small baby deer. He was about to die, so he was worried. What will happen after my death? Who will look after this deer? So wild animals may come and kill it. What will happen? He was so much worried, and he passed away, not thinking of spirituality or God or consciousness or Atman. He died thinking of the deer only. So the king who renounced his kingdom, his children, everything, now became spiritually a slave of the deer. Now, what happened? In the next life, this king was born as a deer. That is the story goes. But remember, the long meditations and spiritual practices that he had performed in his previous life were not lost. That is one speciality of Vedanta. Vedanta tells you that even a little bit of spiritual practice that you do in this life, at this moment, will not be lost. It's like a check that you have deposited in your bank. It will be in your bank, not in this life, next life. So, just think of the fate of the king. Suppose he could die thinking of God and mentally praying to God to look after deer, he would have reached the highest spiritual enlightenment. But instead of that, he was so attached to the deer, and because of that obsession, in the next life, he was born as a deer. And now in the Gita, there is one verse in the 6th chapter. The disciple Arjuna puts a question to Krishna, the master. If somebody practices meditation, yoga, contemplation, prayer, spirituality in this life, but could not make much progress, and if he dies, what happens to him? Will everything be lost? So you have to remember what I said at the very beginning. In Vedanta and Yoga tradition, life is not one. It is not that life is not conceived as a straight line progression, as a single road ending at a destination. Life is a cycle. It continues. It's a flow. Existence is a flow in cyclic rotation. So, when this king was born as a deer, it automatically went to a hermitage and he stayed there. There the number of saints and sages were meditating, contemplating, reading scriptures, and always speculating on spiritual, mystical ideas. So this deer developed a natural tendency to listen to these things, and he stayed there. He didn't go out. So this is one special characteristic of Vedanta. So when Arjuna put this question to Krishna, Krishna told him, you need not worry. Arjuna's question is very graphic in the Gita, in the 6th chapter. The verse is this: Aidis Shraddhayo Pedo Yoga Chalida Manasaka Aprapi Yoga Samsiddhim Kam Gadim Krishna Gacchati. This is the question. See, Arjuna asked, now, a yati means somebody who has not succeeded in becoming a yati, means a person of spiritual wisdom. If a spiritual seeker loses his path, either he dies too young, or if he has a fall, if he has a deviation, if he suddenly gets lost, if he strays away from his spiritual path, is he lost once for all? Whatever he has tried to practice in this life, will it be lost? Then Krishna answers, no. He says, he will not be lost. What happens? When that person is reborn, his mind will have two types of tendencies. One set of tendencies, because good positive spiritual tendencies and impressions, because he has practiced so much of yoga, meditation, contemplation, spiritual practices. All these have created so much of positive tendencies and impressions in his mind. It's like a huge spiritual capital. Good actions that he has done, unselfish, disinterested service that he may have rendered to society. All these sacred readings, scriptures, contemplation, prayer, meditation, all this. Not necessarily going to a place of worship and bowing down, but any good action that he has done, disinterested and selfish action, done to a person, society, or anybody for the matter. All these good actions, good deeds will create a positive spiritual asset, spiritual wealth that will remain in his account. But then there are some other negative tendencies also which are responsible for his deviation, for his failure. So both will be there. So what happens? If the spiritual tendencies are strong, and in the next life, if he finds any opportunity to continue his spiritual practices, either on his by traveling on the road, if he finds a place where people are meditating or contemplating on spiritual topics, he will have a tendency to go and participate in that. If a lecture is going on some spiritual topics, divine contemplation, then he will have a tendency, let me go and participate in that. If the negative tendencies are strong, then if there is a fighting going on, he will have a tendency, let me go and participate in that also. So, negative and also positive tendencies, both will be there in his or her mind. So what happens? So Krishna says, Tatradam buddhi samyogam labhade paurodehikam. His verse is there in the 6th chapter. It's a very graphic expression. Krishna says, he will be reborn, and that next life, his intellect, buddhi means intellect, will come in contact with, his mind will come in contact with identical spiritual ideas. If that person goes to a library and if he finds a religious, spiritually elevating book on the table, he will read it. Or if he comes to know that there is a place where people discuss spiritual topics, he will go there. Because his accumulated tendencies and impressions will force him to move in that direction. And on the other hand, if his tendencies are negative, they will also take him the opposite direction. So that is why any amount of spiritual practice, listening to a talk, praying for a minute, reading a sacred book, contemplating on some elevating spiritual topics is a great spiritual tonic. Even a little bit of it will not be lost. That's why you have to remember, in Vedanta and Yoga, there is no question of eternal damnation. The idea that you have only one life and you have no further choice, at the end of this life you will be admitted to heaven, or you will be damned, you will be thrown, you will be destined to eternal hell. This idea is non-existent in Yoga and Vedantic tradition. Life is eternal. So we can start any day, any moment, a new life. If a person sincerely wants to start a spiritual life, he can start it any moment, any day, from anywhere, wherever he is, because whatever little he does will not be lost. It will be added to his account and it will become a spiritual wealth which belongs to him. That's why Krishna says, Tatratam buddhi samyogam labhade paurodekikam yadade tado bhoya samsiddho kirunandana. That's 6th chapter. Krishna says, a person who fails to achieve anything in this life, in spite of his best effort to practice yoga, Vedanta, spirituality or devotion to God, even if he does a little, that will remain as his spiritual wealth, and the next life his intellect will come in contact with those ideas. So that's why we feel a natural interest in certain things. We don't know why. We feel a natural, inexplicable interest in certain topics. We don't know why. Because of the previous tendencies and impressions we have accumulated. So what happens in the case of this king, he was born as a deer, but he was always contemplating on God, spirituality and highest spiritual ideas. In the previous life, he was born as a great emperor who renounced his kingdom, but he was thinking about a deer. In this life, he was born as a deer, but even while dying, he was contemplating on the highest spiritual wisdom. So what happens? In the next life, the third life, he was born as an enlightened person like Buddha. He was born jnani, means a man of wisdom from his very birth. This is a very interesting story which is often quoted to drive home the idea of law of karma, rebirth, and also the importance or relevance of spiritual practices. Now, whenever we feel restlessness, impatience, or disturbance while trying to practice spirituality, it's because our mind is coming in conflict with negative tendencies, unhealthy tendencies. And this can be countered only by enriching our mind, by spiritually elevating ideas, thoughts and actions. I think we have already finished the allotted time. Now we can have a discussion. If you have got anything to ask, we will have an interaction on any of these topics that I have discussed, or any topics that I have not discussed out. Also we can have a discussion. Any ideas?
Swamiji, with reference to the points that you mentioned just now, suppose in a situation where both the parents are pious and spiritually sadhakas, and the son has a different tendencies and not conducive, not going with the family traditions and all these things, and going on a different path. And according to this discussion, probably this may be because of his previous birth tendencies.
Exactly.
So what are the remedial measures or remedy, or when does that individual mind will take a U-turn or get back on the right track, etc.?
That person may have a lot of negative tendencies, which is that's the reason why he is more, deviating from spiritual path. But he may also have many positive tendencies. That's why he is born to parents who are naturally pious. Because even the parentage also, there is a mutual concordance in this. When an individual jiva who is going to be born again, if he may choose a good parentage, he will be able to choose a good parentage if he has done a lot of good karmas. And parents also may have done a lot of good things to deserve such a son or a daughter, whoever may be. So, if in course of time, such children normally take a turn. But parents can help and encourage and all that. But you remember, in fact, this is one important proof to show that apart from the parentage, each of these human beings are individual jivas, individual human beings. I shall give one illustration from Bhagavata Purana. There's a story of a king who had a son who was a very able youth, and he was thinking of declaring him as the heir apparent. Unfortunately, the young man died. So both the queen and the king were weeping and crying, and they could not be consoled. So Narada, a great sage, came there, and he tried to console them, but he could not. Then the dead body was lying there. Narada was a great saint with occult powers. He brought him back to life. That's a story. It's got an inner message behind, The young man got up. And then Narada told him, look, see, your parents are crying and weeping. Why don't you console them? Then the youth asked the question, which parents? Because when he looked back, he had hundreds of pairs of parents in his previous life. So, his connection, his relationship with these parents is only an accidental relationship, confining to this particular life and our existence. So this, if you can keep in mind, we can help them with all affection and love, but with non-attachment. In fact, that is what is meant by yoga. Show all affection, all obligation, everything, but without becoming a spiritual slave of anybody. In fact, that is the essence of yoga. That's the idea. I would say. Yes. Any somebody?
This is about rebirth and reincarnation, and you sort of answered in that story when the king came back as a deer. I've often had a conflict about the fact that if we took in this life we're a human being. Now it's been said to me, or I read it before, that if you do so and so in a negative way, you can come back as a quote unquote lower form of life. Now, of course, I understand the point that you carry those tendencies with you, but what point, if that's how it works, is it most of us do not remember our previous existence, even though we may have the tendency that stays with us, but we don't really remember that we did so and so, and then we came back as the deer or the snake or a cow or whatever. So I have not a conflict, but I can't understand that. I mean, I can understand that it could happen, okay, and I can understand that if you suppose I go back to Mahayana and I'm taking care of the cows, well. And I over-identify with them, but I don't believe that's how it works. Can you?
Yes, that's true, that we do not normally remember a previous life. But we feel we have certain strong positive obsessions and tendencies and interest which we cannot explain in terms of our experiences in this life. See, there is one difference. If you have got, if you remember your experiences in this life, you remember with name and form. See, if you have seen an elephant 20 years back, when you recollect, you can see the form of the elephant. Mentally, in your mental horizon, you will see the figure. Perhaps if you knew the name also. But previous life experiences are recollected as abstract ideas without name and form. Abstract, inexplicable ideas and tendencies. Otherwise, how do you explain this diversity, this inexplicable contradiction between the character of the parents and also the children? And even in the same family, under the same parentage, you will have 5 children with 5 entirely different, mutually contradictory characteristics. How do you explain it? So, that's why certain impressions belonging to previous life act as inexplicable driving motives, driving forces behind our actions. But this is much more clearly felt for spiritual aspirants. For those who lead a normal life, they are in the flow. See, you feel this, the momentum you feel when you try to swim against the current. If a person who is steeped in worldly or material ideas, and if he leads a very, very worldly life, he won't feel any conflict. Only when we step out of this flow and try to practice, try to go beyond the normal human consciousness, human understanding. When that's what is called yoga, path leading to freedom. Then only we feel this contradiction. But then also, if you feel a strong abstract driving force behind our tendencies, something that we cannot explain in terms of our experiences in this life, then we have to. That's what yoga and Vedanta says. You can find the writings of Edgar Cayce and others, many of these. Of course, sometimes he becomes very simplistic, that cannot be accepted. But yoga and Vedanta give very rational interpretation of these things. That's what I get. Very rational, not exaggerated over generalizations, over simplifications. Yes.
Swamiji, all these accumulated sanskaras in the bija form, in the seed form, in the subtle body or whatever, in the impressions are accumulated. So they at some point has to be worked out. Is that truth? Like that
Yes.
is how, unless it is completely worked out, that soul will continue to do transmigration and keep on taking bodies.
Yes. That is true. That's true.
But then when with the spiritual sadhana and accumulated spiritual merit and by the grace of the divine, is there that decrease or some kind of a I shouldn't say bonus, but some kind of a alleviation of those? Does it occur to the sadhakas because of his spiritual practices?
In Vedantic tradition, this cycle continues only so long as you identify yourself as this psychophysical mechanism. The moment you identify yourself as something beyond this, the supreme consciousness, then you break this chain and come out of this cycle. In Bhakti tradition, it is by the grace of God. In Sayuj, in Bhakti tradition, in devotional tradition, in monotheistic tradition, the idea of going to heaven and putting an end to all the miseries in this world, in fact, originates from this idea, going back to a state where we are not bound, coming out of this cycle of mechanical rotation, the wheel of existence. So this continued existence and this cyclic existence is a reality only so long as you are not aware of your true nature. The moment you realize that you are beyond all this, you are Atman or your supreme consciousness, then you come out of this cycle.
At the beginning of your talk came the premise of the journey of life and the chariot,
Yes.
the mind and the senses and all that.
Yes.
And the destination. The destination would seem an average human experience to be subject to change or malleable. I see that I'm going to this place, but when I get to that place, I see I have to go to another place. See? So, how is one to know what the destination is? I mean, if you take the whole rest of the supposition into account, how would you qualify destination?
Yes. If we can control the horses with our mind, if we can control the senses with our mind properly, with proper wisdom, proper discerning wisdom, then we can reach our spiritual destination. But generally what happens, we will be driven by the senses. Normally, so this is an exact parallel to human existence. See? Senses drag the mind towards sense objects. So horses, instead of being controlled the mind, drag the mind towards the sense objects, towards where it goes. So mind is not able to decide where it should go. But a discerning person should decide that there is something more in this world than these physical, mental pleasures, something beyond all this. In Vedanta we call the supreme consciousness the realization of our true nature. So that destination should be kept in mind. It's an abstract concept. If you get acquainted with these Upanishads and many of these books, you find the first thing that it teaches you that you are not just this psychophysical mechanism which comes and goes, which enjoys and suffers. We are something beyond all this. We are the immanent consciousness, which is also omnipresent, all-pervading and transcendental reality. In fact, this realization, not just conviction, intellectual conviction, this realization is the destination. But this realization is possible only if senses are under perfect control of the mind. But generally what happens, for those whose minds are not well trained, their minds are dragged towards external objects by the senses. There is no choice for them. In fact, to control the horses, you have to be an expert rider. If you let the horses take you wherever they want to take you, then there's no problem. That is the condition of most of humanity. There are few people who stand outside from this flow and pause and think, well, what is the meaning of human existence? What is the meaning of human life? Am I just this physical body comes and goes? This awareness comes sometimes when people get some blows in their life, some setbacks. That sometimes becomes helpful and make them open their eyes. That again depends upon the previous life experiences. If the person had some contact with the higher spiritual ideas, then these setbacks will open his eyes. But if there is nothing, if his account is blank, then he may try to solve his problem at the material world itself. He may move in another direction, which may not be spiritually helpful. So very often these setbacks or some kind of experiences which open our eyes, make us think, what exactly is my true nature? What's the meaning of life? Some people think this way. See, as a human being who comes and goes, who lives in this world and dies away after some time, we are not very different from the plants or animals. There are people who think. And then they turn to mysticism, they turn to philosophy, they turn to introspection and ideas. Then the question arises, what is my destination? Should I allow these horses, in our own senses, to drag me to where they want to take me? Or should I have my own destination? If we decide that I want to reach my destination, then we should be able to control the senses with our mind, controlling the horses with the reins. So Upanishad says, mana pragraham, means mind is the reins with which you direct the horses. Otherwise, the horses will direct the mind, and we may fall over a precipice or we may fall in a ditch. Life also it happens. If the senses are given complete freedom, then it leads to spiritual slavery. If the senses are controlled, it leads to spiritual freedom. So senses can take us to spiritual slavery when they are not under perfect control. When they are properly controlled, they can take us to spiritual freedom. So in the Istu Vijnanavan Bhavati, like that, the Upanishad continues it says, the person who has got a proper discerning mind, proper wisdom, a very discerning approach towards controlling the senses, that person doesn't allow his senses to become a tyrant. Rather, he tries to control the senses. That's the first step in seeking spiritual freedom is trying to control the senses with the mind. Or rather, to prevent the senses from controlling the mind. That's the first step. But very often that's what is happening. That's why, in the Raja Yoga we call Yama, Niyama, the 5 general disciplines and 5 specific disciplines. Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, Parigraha means the non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, then purity or celibacy, and then not receiving of gifts, etc. And then purity, internal and external, contentment, then mental contemplation, reading holy books. If you believe in God, then surrendering to the will of God. If you don't believe in God, then try to read, try to keep the mind busy with spiritual ideas. That's all these ideas are mentioned, which are different paths to control the senses with the mind. So mind, when used to control the senses, takes us to the destination. When mind is dragged to the objects of pleasure by the senses, it leads to spiritual anarchy, spiritual slavery.
Swami, when you say the senses, does that include our emotional state?
Yes. Since the emotional state is a condition of the senses. In fact, all the five senses, see whether senses of action and senses of perception, speech, hearing, touching, smelling, taste, all that, and also hands, feet, all these senses, they all take our mind into different objects. And our emotions are formed in response to the interaction between mind and objects through senses. So mind on the one hand and objects of senses on the other hand. Between them there are senses. So for example, our sense of hearing drags our mind towards an object which produces a noise. And the mind recognizes the existence of a car which produces this noise. So immediately mind is dragged towards that object which produces the noise. Similarly, when we see an object, our eyes, the senses, vision, drag the mind towards the object. Because seeing is nothing but an action coordinated by mind and eyes. Hearing is an action coordinated by mind and ears, and so on. Mind always plays an important role. And immediately an emotion, and a corresponding emotion is created in the mind. Emotion is nothing but a mental response to external objects when senses drag the mind towards them. So, as a first step in spiritual practice, yoga practice, the first step is to keep our senses engaged in creative, useful, spiritually useful pursuits. Mind can never remain idle. Mind can never remain idle. Mind itself is nothing but a name of a function. Mind is nothing but name of a vritti, Sankalpa vikalpatmika antakarana vritti mana. I mean, see, mind is nothing but the name of human emotions or vibrations functioning in a particular manner. That is what mind really means. Mind is not an entity as such. So, mind can never be kept idle. So if you don't feed your mind with creative, spiritually useful ideas, mind will choose its own unhealthy, spiritually harmful ideas. So to prevent the mind from feeding itself with unhealthy food, better feed the mind with healthy food. And healthy food, the mind is healthy ideas, spiritually illuminating ideas. Reading good books, listening to good ideas, visiting places which remind us of spiritual ideas. All these are different forms of feeding the mind with spiritually nourishing food. If you don't feed it, the mind will go out of it, it will choose its own dirty food and ditch water. So better feed the mind with spiritually healthy ideas. Healthy ideas. Mind should be always kept busy in a world of spiritually elevating ideas, illuminating ideas. That's one way to keep the mind away from negative ideas. That's why when we talk about controlling the mind, we actually mean diverting the mind towards creative channels, spiritually creative channels. We don't really control the mind. You heard of the story, I mentioned this earlier. A man was suffering from bald, he was slowly growing bald. Then he went to an Ayurvedic doctor, not an allopathic doctor. So the Ayurvedic doctor told him, you never think of an egg. If you think of an egg, your head also will become like that. Now, that man's whole lifetime was spent on avoiding thinking about egg, which means he was always thinking about egg. And he became completely bad. So what really happens, we can never deliberately keep the mind away from anything. We can never deliberately keep the mind away from anything. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna says, Swami Vivekananda's teacher, Sri Ramakrishna says, the best way to move towards the West is to move away from the East. The best way to move away from the West is to move towards the East. If you move towards North or South, you are not sure you are moving away from the West. So the best way to move away from the West is to move towards the East, and both ways you can write. So, the best way to avoid mind getting trapped in a world of negative ideas is to keep feeding it with positive ideas. Any kind of positive ideas. If you can't think of God or spirituality, think of philosophy, think of higher intellectually stimulating ideas. That's the best way. That's why you find, when our educational curriculum neglects humanities, philosophy, painting, literature, history, and becomes obsessed with technology and science, what happens? Human beings also become more like demons or machines. With the higher, finer human ideas and tendencies are not getting a proper orientation in modern educational system because it becomes obsessed with technology. So if any interest, even if a person cannot keep himself busy in spiritual ideas, philosophy, history, all these are avenues which keep the mind away from the lower levels, lower emotional levels. Om, peace, peace, peace.